Hey all, this video is going to be about air shocks and bump stops, kind of the same thing, but I had a little story about air shocks first I wanted to tell, and then we can get into how they work. So I'll tell a story before I share the hardware. I was on a construction site working as a painting contractor, and crap, I had to be 2003 or 4, maybe 5. I get a call from Dave Cole. I just recently met him. He said, hey, there's this guy in Australia, I didn't know anything about this, has an air shock, and in the bottom of it is a hydraulic cylinder, and then you plug it into your power steering system, and then you can raise the car up. Thought about that, said, I think I can do that. He's like, oh, cool, well, let me know what it takes. And so I started thinking about it, and that was like on a Monday, Tuesday, and then on Saturday I called him and said, what are you doing? He said, I'm on the way down to San Diego Zoo with Bailey to take Bailey to the zoo. And I'm like, cool, stop by. So what I ended up with is this. So these blue lines are temporary, but this is a Fox air shock. You can tell, 1.25 inch shaft, and it's hollow. What I did is make this gland, this is a long time ago, made this gland to thread in and seal, and then there's a 5/8 shock shaft that goes through it to a piston in here, and then it's a hydraulic cylinder. And just a little demonstration. A little bit of air for this so it moves kind of fast, but right? So we could extend the shock 9 3/4 inches to raise the car, so we could have a really low belly height for stability, but then clear stuff, and then could also pick the back tires up or the front tires, whatever we had to, if we were high centered, and then stack rocks underneath them, and then the question of legality came up. Was it legal? And we talked to Big and Little Rich, and they said it's legal as long as both fronts and both rears go out at the same time. We can't individually, we have to go both fronts and both rears. So we went to G&J and found what they call a rotary flow controller. And pause right here and I'll go see if I can find that. So rotary flow controller. We talked to Cliff at G&J, and he was really interested, and we went back in the nether regions of G&J, and if you've never been there, that's a pretty cool place. He searched around in boxes like he'd seen them before, and he came up with this. This is a rotary flow controller from a P-38 Lightning airplane. You put pressure in this side, and then, or oil it through this side at high hydraulic pressures, and out these two ports, you get the exact same volume of oil, and therefore this was actually the one we used on the front, and we could raise both fronts the same. And then we had one of these on the back, and I think one late night or early morning, depending on which end of the clock you work on. For me it was early morning, for Dave it was late night. He called me and said, I can't figure it out. And we had put this in and not taken it apart. Well, inside was full of this bluish cotton stuff, and we destroyed it by running a bunch of that bluish cotton through it with high pressure. And we had to, in a pinch, find one, and we went to the local hydraulic shop, and they had this, which is very heavy and never worked as good as the other one, but worked okay. Also a rotary. This is not a rotary flow controller. This is a spool type flow controller. Pressure in, pressure out, but it worked. We called it the easy button because if I was spotting for him, I'd just yell easy button rear and then lift it up, or easy button up in the rear, and I'm putting up rocks under the tires, and then he'd go down on the easy button, and then it'd lift the car off, and we'd unbelly, and it was a lot of fun. And eventually met Pete Antonak. Pete Antonak was the guy in Australia that was making these out of swayaways, and Pete and I are good friends, did a lot of work with him when he was over here, raced a cool car. And that's my air shock story. So I wanted to, before we get into the technical stuff, give you some background. This is the side of the car off of that car that Dave Cole and I rock crawled with. We signed it Dave's the best year ever. I signed it. Chris Cabrera, who was our crew chief, signed it. And part of that learning curve for competition air shocks for me was figuring out how to get the ride height right. And I don't like guessing. I don't guess well, so I don't like guessing. So I had to devise a way to get the ride height right every time we'd leave this shop, and the car would be at the right ride height, or we'd have to do work on something, and before I let the car back down onto its own weight after reinstalling, it would be at the right ride height. And I'll show you how to do that, or I'll explain how to do that in this video. Let's stick our toe in the water on air shocks, and after air shocks we'll get into some nitrogen requirements and not an air shock. So this is an air bump. It's a bump stop. It's made to provide you additional extra force outside the shock, so you don't have to ruin the ride of the shock to get some bump resistance, you know, that last little bit of resistance when you do hit something a bit too hard and you blow through the travel. This is an air shock, and it's called an air shock. It's a smooth body emulsion shock. A smooth body emulsion shock with a large displacement shaft. Like this shaft displaces, well, it's 1.25 inches. And so there's a bit of oil in here. And I don't remember the cc's, but it's a height somewhere in here-ish. And there's all this squish room up here, and that oil and that nitrogen, it's usually nitrogen because of the inert nature of nitrogen, and I've explained inert gases before, so I won't go into that again unless you want me to. But basically, all that stuff is mixed up, and as the large shaft plunges into the shock, since there's no place for any of that to go, it simply compresses the nitrogen, and that compression of that nitrogen, a displacement spring is what they'd be called, but it basically displaces area, makes the nitrogen be higher pressure, and that acts like a spring. The whole world is a spring, to quote AVE, one of my favorite YouTubers. You familiar with an expanding gas spring every time you've shot a gun or watched anything blow up, honestly. The power in compressed gas is pretty amazing, but it's just like a mechanical steel or composite steel or composite spring, and it will store energy and give it back right away. And that's how they work. You put nitrogen in this port to a given pressure, and then the displacement of the shaft becomes a spring, so you don't need a spring with it. So let's talk about the air bump a little bit. We didn't do very much on that. So this is an air shock. It's the same as this. It basically got about 100 cc's of oil in it, which is not very much, and then nitrogen. And when this shaft plunges in because you hit something, then you compress that nitrogen, causes a spring. There's a bunch of damping, there's a bunch of shims on the damping piston. And I will tell you that in my experience, people will not like this, but in my experience, especially with some dyno time we've done, the shims don't make much difference in the compression stroke. It's mostly, the compression stroke is almost, I'm going to say 90% of the force is due to the air spring. So way bigger difference messing with oil volume and pressures than actually putting shims, changing the shim stack. The shims do react and rebound quite well, so adding more rebound to keep it from decompressing fast is not always a bad thing, but that's kind of all you would do. We don't revalve them a lot. We will again, but it doesn't do a lot. That's why we don't. So again, it's the same as an air shock. It's just less travel, less area, high pressure yeah. This is a 202 inch, 203 inch. And there is, 2.5. And there's all sorts of cool stuff being done with bypasses, with bump stops. There's all sorts of stuff being done with bump stops, reservoirs and bypass tubes and all sorts of stuff. It's all been done before. Pretty much most people in the keep it simple stupid racing, keep it simple, stupid racing end up right back here. Simple. They don't emulsify. They're already emulsified, so you don't have to worry about them emulsifying. They don't cavitate because they're pre-cavitated. You don't need to worry about them. They just work. Okay. Here we are at a better whiteboard than the table, although I prefer the table better. I feel pressure to do a good job here, so let's just explain the air shock bump stop thing. Let's draw a small one first. Bump stop. Okay, bump stop has a bearing, has a shaft that's large, 1.25 inches to 1 5/8 ish. Shaft comes up, got a little bit of a spacer, got a tenon post, piston on the tenon post, nut here. Okay, the oil is here-ish. Those are all waves like water, so they're here. And that's oil in lines, bop, 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 bop. That's all oil. This is nitrogen. You usually fill them up here. Schrader. Okay, hope you can see that. Maybe we'll zoom in. I'll look. So bump pad here, plastic thing here to make it not clack so loud, although the aluminum ones always work too. So say you fill this to 200 psi. So that's your bump stop ready to go. A-arm, comes up, hits it, and then this starts to move up. Then you get something like this. Same thing. See, I don't do very well when I'm under pressure. Same thing, we got bump stop, bearing. The pad is now collapsed, right? And then the shaft is way up here, tenon, and piston. So piston. So now we have oil, and it is mixed with the nitrogen because they've foamed, because they don't remain like this. It doesn't take very long for it to just be shaving cream. Well, what happens is, since we've taken up all this area, so we've basically taken up the area of the shaft. So that's pi r squared. That's the diameter of the shaft. The radius of the shaft times squared times pi is the area of the shaft, and then times that by the amount of inches, which let's just call this one 2 inches, has plunged in, and that's the area we've taken out. And so what we've done is we've made all this nitrogen all be squeezed in one area, so the pressure can be very high, up to 2,000 psi or more, depending on how much oil and how much room there is for it to squish. So that makes a really heavy spring, and that's why you'll always have lots of rebound damping on the piston of a bump stop to keep it from plunging back out. And you'll hear me say that it's never rebound, that the buck is always some sort of a bounce, and that is true. But two things, the thing that causes the bounce is all the decompression of the components, mostly the tire, secondly the chassis, and thirdly anything else that is helping to push off. And if this doesn't have a lot of rebound, it can help push off, and can help the buck be worse, or if it's not a buck, at least make the car rise more out of the hole than you want it to when it does hit the bump. So that's basically how that works. So then we'll take, and these are emulsion shocks, the oil and the air is mixed. So then we'll take an air shock, longer, a terrible artist, but same thing, same bearing. We got us a 1 inch spacer here, and then we got washer, and then we got the tenon post. some shims, and a piston. And then a nut here. Okay, now we have oil to about here, waves again. So this is all oil, and this is while at rest, but keep in mind, as soon as this travels very much, this all gets, all this oil and air mixed to be a foam, so you're damping with actually a foam. It doesn't take more than a bump or two for all that stuff to be mixed. Just like shaking up your, just like dropping Mentos in Diet Coke or shaking your beer. That's the aeration that's in it, and it all is in there, same kind of thing. And then we have nitrogen, and this shaft goes out, obviously. And then say you put, in your car, it's a light car, so you know that you want 160 PSI, and that keeps you at the ride height, gives you the spring rate. And what determines that spring rate is, as this shaft plunges in and takes up this room, and this room gets less here, then the amount of squish that happens is what the spring is this nitrogen or compressible gas, whatever it is compressed. It pushes back on the diameter of the shaft, and for this diameter shaft, it's just that. And so it's pi r squared. And if you really want me to do that, I guess I can get my phone to do it. I don't do math in my head because I'm not good at it. So 1.25 times 0.5 is 0.625. Is that right? No, I did that wrong. 1.25 times 0.5 is 0.625 squared. Equals times 625 is 0.390. That's close enough. And we times that by pi, 3.14, where most people stop, 159, and it goes on and on, never ending, but engineering pi is 3.14159. So we times the 0.390 times 3.14159 equals, and we basically get equals 1.227 square inches. Okay? So then, if we plunge that 1.227 square inches times 14, we've taken up 17.18 square inches, and we take that volume of nitrogen, whatever it is, and compress it that much, and that is our spring force or spring rate at this particular compression. And the nitrogen spring is very is not linear. It does that. It is not straight rate like a steel spring. And then we'd call this a gas spring. Is the spring rate looks like that. And so that's how that works. The formula to calculate that is pretty high. Is more than I'm going to do in a video. It's not hard, just a lot of it. What I would do when I ran air shocks is I would do what everybody did. We called it the calibrated pebble. We're out at the desert, we're on the lake bed. We jack the car up, we put air in both of them, or in all the shocks. We get it way too tall, and then we go around slowly with a calibrated pebble, screwdriver, pocket knife. Dave Cole was on one, always looking for a calibrated pebble, and he'd pick one with a little sharp end. And we let it out and then shake the car and get it so we're at the right ride height. What you do after you do that, and you can do that more scientifically, but that's what most people end up doing. What you can do after that is you can raise the car all the way up and then put your gauge on the shock and see how much pressure is actually in them after you've got it at the ride height you want. And as long as the oil volume doesn't change, you should be able to go at the shop, car raised off the ground with a hoist or whatever you have. You've done that procedure, and you know that 160 fully extended is where your shock needs, what your pressure needs to be in the front, and 100 in the rear. And you do that, put it in, set it down. You may have to adjust that a little bit just because of anomalies and leaky gauges and gauge differential and all that. But eventually, if you use the same gauge, you can do it fast and it's always the same and it works out okay. So that's how you set up the spring in an air shock. The smaller air shocks aren't really capable of carrying a lot of weight because it's only 1.22 square inches holding the weight. So you need to have, you know, if you have 200 psi behind that, it's 1.227 times 200, and that's what it'll carry. That's the weight that it's going to hold. Any more weight than that, it'll collapse until the volume gets smaller, and then the pressure gets higher, and that's a pretty easy way to figure out how much it's going to hold. The bigger air shocks, 2.5-inch air shocks, they have a bigger shaft, 1 5/8. Obviously more area, more weight capacity. So if you got a heavy car on one air shocks, you kind of need the bigger air shocks. A light car, you know, buggy, rock crawler, moon buggy, air shocks are probably fine for those, and they work pretty well. They are emulsion shock. What's an emulsion shock? Well, that's this. That's where all there's little bubbles everywhere. And you've basically got shaving cream in here. So the shims, well, they're there, but you've reduced the mass of the oil a great deal. What do you mean by reduce the mass? Well, the mass of nitrogen is like 5 moles? 5 moles, I believe. The mass of oil is 15,000 moles, 15,500 moles. I'm not saying that right, but it's more than 15,000 moles. That's a lot of difference. So it doesn't take very much of that 5 mole nitrogen mixed with that 15,000 mole petroleum oil to reduce the mass a great deal. The rule of thumb is 10% gas in a liquid reduces the mass by about 50%. Mass is what we do the damping with. Mass is what we squish through the hole, creating the conversion from kinetic movement, kinetic energy to heat. So that's why an emulsion shock isn't terribly efficient shock. You got to separate that oil from the nitrogen, and that brings us to remote reservoirs. We might do a little bit on that in this one just to see. And I'm going to show you some other air shocks. There's some pretty cool air shocks. They're not just like this. There's some bypass air shocks, some way back in the day. If anybody's seen my fire pit out of the desert, there's some classic ones that my buddy Chris got that for me off of Race Desert, I believe. But those are some pretty iconic shocks welded to that. I didn't do it. I'm happy to have them. I wish they weren't welded to a fire pit. I'll see if I can't get over and take some pictures, some working knife crank shocks. There's some other ones that are out there. ORIs are an air shock. They have multiple chambers. I'm not going to try to draw an ORI, but basically they have chambers that have air on the bottom and air on the top, and you fill one more and more so it keeps the pistons separated. Do they work? Yes, they work very well for rock crawling. I don't particularly care for them. Every ORI car I've ever wheeled with ever has come back with one corner sagging, one corner high, and then it's difficult. It's not that I'm not a fan. I like the principle for rock crawling. I don't like it for what I do, and so I don't use them and I don't get into them. And they've been problematic. They've been problematic for me, so I've had enough. So we're out in the Izzy shop. Got a air shock. It's a little bit different. I just wanted to show you a quick view of a 2.5-inch air shock, 1 5/8 shaft. I promise I won't bore you with the math on this one. 2.5-inch OD, 14-inch travel, got some bypass tubes on it. Still an emulsion shock, still bypass tubes are small, I'm not sure. They'd had a ton of effect on the overall ride, probably some, but not a ton. You see these made with reservoir, big port, big res, bigger tubes, and the nitrogen is actually carried in the reservoir if it's on it. And if they're built that configuration, they actually work very well. They do have a pump up problem where with temperature they grow in height. But this is one set I have sitting in my collection of cool old stuff. You may recognize it as a particular King of the Hammers winter car. I'll let you guess what era, but that's what they came off of. So that's something I thought was pretty cool I have in the shop. Get some more air shocks to have a look. So a different air shock. This is called a float shock. These are significantly different than the simple off-road stuff we're using. They have chambers inside chambers. Still the same principle. A large shaft that displaces a lot of volume. You got your standard reservoir here. That's for the oil displaced by the shaft. You can put air in it here for that reservoir. Has a base valve here that works the same. Has a small reservoir to control a metered amount of oil that goes into one passage. And then it has a metering rod through the shaft that controls oil flow somewhere through the shock. And they're online. You can see the cutout of these. They work pretty slick. The patent will take you 4 hours of just staring at to figure out how they work. It's pretty impressive what John did with this, but it's good shock. Pretty sure this one is a snowmobile shock. Got the roost guard, all that, and then another place to put air in it here and here. This air goes different chamber. This air pushes here for the oil flowing in and out of it. Pretty impressive build. These work really good on the bicycles, snowmobiles, lighter vehicles. That big shaft means you don't have to have near so much pressure in them. We're not putting 400 or 500 PSI anymore. We're putting a couple, way less. If you're familiar with their bicycle line, this is kind of the same thing, only might even be a downhill bike shock, but I don't remember. It did sit outside. It is not a working shock. I believe this was an old display model that was taken off. So that's just another air shock. So that's it. That's a brief discussion about air shocks and bump stops. So if you like what you're seeing, comment down below. We're watching that stuff. We want to know what you want to know, so we can make videos to answer your questions, answer everybody's questions. So comment down below. We like that. In fact, the next video that's coming up is about remote reservoirs and nitrogen pressure and some of the parameters to figure out what is right there. And that came directly from the comments and questions that we got asked while tuning. So thank you all very much. We're really enjoying doing this. Like and subscribe, do all that good stuff, and we'll see you on the next one.